I doubt not of our author's regard to the worthy men he mentions, and I make no question but they deserve the characters he gives them. Yet I do not think I transgress the bounds of charity when I allege that the above high characters are given them as much out of a sly design to impress the simple and credulous readers, as from a just and true regard to these worthy men themselves, as appears from his above words. The author of the essay lets the world know that he has a good number of books in his hand, but I must beg leave to observe that the most part of his quotations are applied in a manner contrary to the intention and design of the worthy authors. If the connection of the purposes which they treat, and out of which the quotations are taken, is duly considered, and therefore I humbly judge I may justly apply to our author some words of Dr. Owen in his defense of the dissenters against Dr. Stillingfleet, who seems to have managed the argument against the dissenters after the same manner. Quote, "Neither," says he, "to my knowledge, did I ever read a book wherein there was a greater appearance of diligence in the collection of things, words, sayings, expressions, discourses unto other ends, which might only cast odium on the cause opposed, or give advantage for arguings unto a seeming success, very little or no way belonging unto the cause in hand, than there is in this of our reverend author." Unquote. I have given several particular instances, which I hope will satisfy the reader that the above observation is just. I have not pursued every quotation of our authors, otherwise I have drawn forth this performance to a greater length, and I fear I have ground to make an apology for writing so much upon the subject. It is very much contrary to my own inclination, but the great variety of matter that the essay has brought upon the field has obliged me unto it. I must further observe that though quotations from great and learned men may be of very considerable use to illustrate and clear an argument, yet if the argument, especially when it is upon a religious subject, leans only to the authority of men, the simple and credulous may be either amused or imposed upon, but it can never be convincing and satisfying to such as with knowledge and judgment search after the truth. Besides, when in dispute the authority of great and learned men is thrown up, we are led to inquire unto the sense and meaning of these great writers, and it is often a fruitless spending of time to insist in debates upon the sense and meaning of the words of great and learned men. I would have willingly avoided anything of this nature, but our author has obliged me unto it, not only that I may do justice unto the great names whom I judge our author has injured, but especially that I may do justice to the cause against which he has employed his pen. I have frequently brought some of our author's learned and great men against himself, and made use of others for clearing and illustrating my argument. But if any principles and conclusions that I have laid down are found only in the authority of men, if they are not built upon the divine testimony, or if they are not supported by sound reason in agreeableness to the Word of God, and the acts and constitutions of this church founded thereon, let them be rejected, and I shall reckon myself obliged to our author, or any other who shall discover them unto me. With respect to our author's treatment of our reforming period, he apprehends that it may be thought, quote, that it may be thought strange that he has given so many instances of faults and failings or bad acts of our assemblies from 1638 to 1649 inclusive, which, says he, have been reckoned by some the purest times of Presbytery, unquote. It is very obvious that our author is none of these same, who reckon these times the purest times of Presbytery. But however diminutively our author may speak of them, yet the bulk and body of Presbyterians who have known these times, or who are acquainted with the history of them, have always esteemed them as times both of divine power and great purity in the Church of Scotland, excelling any after period of this church in many instances, till now that the author of the essay, a professed Presbyterian, has discovered some acts of tyranny in the administration of these times, if not exceeding, yet equal at least to, anything that can be alleged from the conduct of the present judicatories of this national church. But he makes the following apology for what he is apprehensive may be thought strange. Quote, "I own," says he, "the Lord honored his faithful servants in that period to do much for his glory, for which I desire to give praise, and my witness is in heaven. I have not mentioned any of these with a desire or design to blacken the Church of Scotland or such worthy ministers as lived in that period, but for her vindication at this day, etc." Unquote. After such a solemn appeal to heaven, I shall judge charitable of our author's intentions and designs. He to whom the appeal is made can only penetrate into them. But then I must be allowed to say that the tendency and design of what he writes upon his head is to weaken all the arguments drawn from that period for the purity of our Reformation. He owns that the Lord honored his faithful servants, but does he ever mention any particular step of reformation attained unto or maintained in the foresaid period? We have as fair and smooth general that his faithful servants did much for his glory, but does he ever tell us any of these things which they did for his glory? Nay, when he speaks of our reforming period, he tells us it was reckoned by some the purest times of Presbytery, but often mentions it under the name of that extolled period. And he gathers together through his book anything that he can invent or allege against it. He throws up what he reckons their faults, failings, or bad acts, without mentioning their faithful and zealous proceedings in a work of reformation. Let the unprejudiced world judge if a performance of this kind has not a direct tendency to blacken the above reforming period. But not to insist upon this, let us examine what our author declares to be his own intention and design in giving so many instances of faults and failings and bad acts of former assemblies. It is, says he, quote, "for her vindication," that is, of the Church of Scotland, "at this day, and to show that though the chief ground urged by sundry for separation in our day is alleged dreadful, scandalous, unparalleled apostasy from what the Church of Scotland was in that period, yet the practice of judicatories then is what can as little be justified in sundry things as the practice of the Church of Scotland in our times." Unquote. In his short vindication, page 10, he tells us that in the above-mentioned instances he has, quote, "nothing so much in view as the justification of the Church of Scotland at this day from the charge of being such a scandalously apostate church from what she was in that period, that now no communion is to be kept with her." Unquote. What is here advanced by our author is designed to relieve his reader from the strange thoughts he may entertain with respect to his own conduct in the instances which he gives of the bad acts of the former period. But how can any reasonable man imagine that giving instances of the faults, failings, or bad acts of a church in one period can tend to the vindication or justification of the bad acts of a church in another period? Or how can they tend to prove that notwithstanding of these bad acts, communion is still to be kept with her? But if our author only means a comparative vindication and justification of the Church of Scotland at this day, I have examined the charge he brings against the period mentioned, and I hope I have discovered the falsehood of it in many particular instances. But was it true that the proceedings of the judicatories were then as bad as now, or that they were as tyrannical in the administration in the former as in the present period? Yet our author's confusion would never follow from his premises, since he owns that, quote, "her conduct in that period is not to be our rule, but as it agrees with the divine testimony," and adds, "her failings are not to be instanced as precedents for imitation, nor mentioned as the least excuse for our faults in later times." Unquote. He might then have spared all his pains and not mentioned any of them for the Church's vindication at this day, seeing they are so far from being a vindication that, according to his own sentiments, they cannot be the least excuse for our faults in later times. I must further observe upon this head, that as the argument is laid by our author from the instances of failings and bad acts of former assemblies, in order to vindication and justification of the Church of Scotland at this day, he has indeed managed it with abundance of cunning, but not with that candor that becomes one of his profession and character. In regard, he only mentions alleged failings and bad acts of our reforming period. If he had dealt honestly with the former and present generations, he ought likewise to have compared the proceedings of the judicatories at this day, with the faithful and zealous contendings of the Church of Scotland for Reformation work from the year 1638 to 1649. And if he had stated the comparison justly upon this head, his reader might easily have seen that the charge of the defection from our Reformation purity that is laid against the present judicatories can very well be vindicated, notwithstanding of the instances he alleges against the assemblies during the foresaid period. His reader might likewise have seen the vast difference that there is betwixt the general and habitual course of the proceedings of the assemblies during our reforming period, and the procedure of assemblies in the present times of lamentable degeneracy and defection, namely, that the former were towards reformation, and that the latter have a manifest tendency toward the deformation, and consequently that all our author's alleged instances of faults, failings, and bad acts of assemblies in the former period of this church, when duly examined, make nothing at all to his purpose. Upon the whole, notwithstanding the above apology, the author makes for himself, I cannot conceive what he gained anything by the many instances he alleges of bad acts of former assemblies, wherewith he swells his book, and which he repeats I know not how often, but the hardening of the present generation in their iniquity, when it is represented unto them through the whole of the essay that their sins were equaled, if not exceeded, in a period which has been reckoned the purest times of this church, as also the exposing of the Church of Scotland to the ridicule of our common adversaries, who have always stretched their wicked inventions to defame our reforming period, and who may now make their boast of it, that a professed son of the Church of Scotland does in several instances symbolize with them in the contempt they have poured out upon the famous assembly 1638 and other assemblies of that period. Our author makes another solemn appeal in the following terms, quote, though here I can appeal to the searchers of hearts, I have laid nothing with the design to displease any, and said nothing but what I conceive to be truth and matter of fact, yet as I have not written with a design to please any party, so I lay my account with censure from persons of very different sentiments, etc. Unquote. Though I have given several particular instances of things advanced by our author that are neither true nor matter of fact, yet I shall charitably judge that he conceives what he has writ to be truth and matter of fact. Only I wish he had been more tender in making such solemn appeals and attestations, which appear to me to be equivalent to a solemn oath. Or I wish that at least he had been better advised what he has written, before he had ushered in his essay to the world with such weighty and awful attestations. He insinuates in his preface that it had been 2 years at least upon his hands, and I conceive the Church of Scotland would have been at no loss, neither would truth have sustained any prejudice, though it had lain till this day in his closet amongst his other papers, which, according to his advertisement, he was once resolved to publish. But whatever his or my conceptions may be, I doubt if he will persuade everyone who reads his essay and who knows the history of this church to believe that he himself is well assured that everything is truth and matter of fact which he reports in his essay. It is a considerable loss unto this church that we want a full and just history of the above-mentioned period. We have nothing but some scattered shreds and fragments of the history of these times. However, I have endeavored from the best historical vouchers that I could find to give some short account of the rise and progress of Reformation work in the year 1638. This, with other historical accounts that I have given, for the vindicating that despised period from the contempt that many cast upon it, and for discovering the falsehood of several matters of fact alleged in the essay, as well as very much swelled in this book. Yet I hope it will not be disagreeable to the lovers of Scotland's covenanted Reformation, and may be useful for the information of such as are willing to receive it, the most part of the present generation being very much unacquainted with the remarkable appearances of the Lord for his church in former times, and with the faithful proceedings and contendings of our reforming fathers for maintaining and carrying on a work of reformation in this land. As I have no pleasure in controversial writings, so I had no inclination to attempt an examination of the Reverend Mr. C.'s essay on separation, considering the difficulties that attend an undertaking of this kind, especially at this judicature, not only from the critical humor of the age, but also from the different views and divided sentiments that are to be found even among such who fear the Lord in this day of perplexity in our valley of vision. Being also conscious to myself of my own insufficiency for managing a work of this nature, yet I was led by the hand of Providence to it in the following manner.